Today's sermon is titled, What We Learned About Racial Justice. Our monthly racial justice study group began August 2020 and is comprised of Catherine Lakish, Janet Cooper, Robert Wilkinson, Diane DeMarco, Mary Schwalbe, and myself, Dolores Miera, and our group leader, Nancy Tolan. We came together monthly in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Nancy Tolan spearheaded the study group by picking out books, articles, and YouTube videos dealing with many aspects of racism. Some of the books we read and discussed were Just Mercy, My Grandmother's Hands, The Fire This Time, Why We Can't Wait, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, Me and White Supremacy, and others. Some of us were also educating ourselves about racism by attending for a year a UUA-sponsored class called Beloved Conversations. Come along with us and let us share our significant and personal realizations that we want to share with you this morning. Our speakers today are Diane DeMarco, Janet Cooper, and Nancy Tolan. Diane.
It was in 1972. I was 20 years old when I was hired at the UCB Bank in downtown Los Angeles on Washington and Vermont as a safe deposit custodian and part-time teller. On the same day that I reported for work, another young woman, Deborah, same age as I, reported for work for the first time too. She was a Negro, which was the term we used in those days. She had teller experience. She knew how a bank operated. I was so green around the gills and unenlightened about banking that I actually pushed the alarm on the first day by accident instead of the button right next to the alarm, which would have let people through the locked door. Police showed up with guns drawn. I was so embarrassed, but to my amazement, my operations manager didn't fire me. On that first day, I was told by the operations manager that the bank couldn't keep both Deborah and me. In 3 months, one of us would have to go, and it would depend upon the workload and how well each of us did as to who that would be. I was nice to Deborah and remember smiling a lot at her, which covered up my own insecurity that I was competing with a Black woman for this job. My niceness meant that I wasn't a racist, or so I thought. Besides, I dated a Black guy in high school, another way I showed that I wasn't prejudiced. Wasn't that proof enough? I was comforted by my own rationality. The belief that I wasn't a racist because I was polite, I have learned, is at the root of the most common kind of white defensiveness. Most white people continue to believe that racism is an isolated and individual act of intentional meanness. It isn't. Niceness, according to Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility and Nice Racism, is conveyed through tone of voice, eye contact, smiling, and conjuring of affinities. Deborah was a Marvin Gaye fan, and I was too, which was another reason I believed I wasn't a racist. Was I authentic? I thought so, but in truth, nice forbids a consciousness of racism. Benign conflict is forbidden in a culture of niceness. Robin DiAngelo, in her book, White Civility, continues, the unspoken social agreement of niceness creates a protective force field around racial dynamics. And if that force field is broken, white solidarity will rally to protect the status quo, end quote. Niceness can function as a passive-aggressive way to conceal anger, numbness, fear, or shame. Yep, that's what I was really feeling. At the end of the 3 months, I was chosen to stay on and Deborah was laid off. Seemed fair to me, clear as day. Deborah had missed a number of days at work. I hadn't. Deborah had come back a few times late from lunch. I hadn't. I deserved to be hired and she didn't. We were equal and I had won. Now, 50 years later, I'm wondering how fair that choice had been. After Deborah left, I learned from a gossipy teller in the lunchroom that she was the eldest of 4 siblings. She was driving them to daycare before work in an old rickety car. She was in charge of their lunches. Deborah had an alcoholic father who she hadn't seen in over 5 years, and she had a sickly mother who had been in and out of the hospital a few times in the 3 months that I had known her. Deborah was not attending a university when the summer was over. I was. One afternoon, I witnessed Deborah expressing some anger after the bank had closed because a customer had made a racist remark to her. The operations manager was not happy with her demonstration of emotion and even asked her, "Well, if you show angry to us, would you do the same with our customers?" I was shocked to hear him say this, but it worked. Deborah backed off. She piped down, and then she said nothing. D'Angelo did a study that showed that Blacks are constantly monitoring their emotions to make white people comfortable. D'Angelo makes a point of letting us know that white employees are typically dumbfounded when their colleagues of color testify powerfully to the daily slights and indignities they endure and the isolation they feel in overwhelmingly white workplaces. What I now know is that Deborah didn't have the same opportunities that I had. She didn't grow up in a middle-class home with a well-tuned car looking for to complete a college education, a trip to Europe, great medical help, parents who were available and not sickly. Like most white people, I lived a segregated life and had no lasting cross-racial relationships. Yet I believed myself to be free of racism because I was nice. What has changed for me? Recognizing the opportunities in the life I had as opposed to what Deborah had. I now consider it my responsibility to demonstrate that I am behaving in a supportive way and not just being polite or nice. It's my world, my environment, and my fight to validate the racial justice work by being willing to step up and take action when needed. This is what differentiates niceness from kindness. Kindness is compassionate and often implicates actions to support or intervene. Way back in 1972, I was nice. I was not kind. If I was in the same room with another who used a racist term to address a person of color today, I would speak up for that person of color. I might say, "That was not necessary," or "Is this person's race relevant to your story?" Or "That comment makes me feel uncomfortable." Would it be easy? No. Would I be scared? Yes. At least I would no longer be an unconscious or disingenuous white liberal. Thank you. And now Janet will speak.
Reading and discussing Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad was not a comfortable endeavor. She calls out in particular white liberals who believe themselves to be doing all the right things and as being part of the solution versus part of the problem. Much of the liberal community's contribution to maintaining white supremacy involves microaggressions, seemingly small actions that serve to keep society's systemic racism firmly in place. Microaggressions are defined as commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards a stigmatized or culturally marginalized group. Let's take a closer look at what types of behavior Layla Saad identified as being particularly caustic and introduce an acronym frequently used throughout her book. Dolores mentioned it before. It's BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C, and stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. I will present her observations in conjunction with my own life experiences as described in a short one-page essay that I wrote after reading the book. I'll start at the beginning of my essay. It is very difficult to acknowledge my own personal participation and unintentional support of white supremacy. I had always believed white supremacists were the blatantly, often violently, racist whites who were loud and clear about their intentions. I never assumed that simply, quietly participating in a racist system was more destructive to BIPOC lives than the few outspoken individuals who make the news cycles with their violent rhetoric and actions. Cloaked in a thin veneer of civility, but still destructive, racism was widely prevalent in the middle-class America of the 1950s and 60s. Warnings about going into the wrong parts of town occupied by Black or brown residents were common. Talk amongst my parents' friends about how unfair affirmative action rules were that required companies to hire minorities. Derogatory slang used in jokes, accompanied by "it's just a joke, don't get offended." And repeated references to the moral fiber and strong work ethic unique to Europeans were bandied about on a daily basis. Let's unpack this behavior as it has been labeled and described by Layla Saad. First, the belief that affirmative action rules were unfair and unnecessary. This behavior fits Saad's discussion of colorblindness. Colorblindness tells us that even talking about different races is divisive and creates racism. Colorblindness believes that if Blacks and other minorities would just stop thinking about the past, work hard, and complain less, particularly about racial discrimination, then Americans of all hues could just get along and forget about government programs and policies to try and redress the historical wrongs and damage done to communities of color. Each BIPOC individual must shoulder the burden of systemic racism on their own. Colorblindness is also an act of gaslighting, a particularly cruel way of making the BIPOC community believe that they are just imagining that they are being treated the way they are because of their skin color. Colorblindness allows white people to see themselves as raceless or normal, with everyone else being other. Subscribing to colorblindness allows white people to avoid reflecting on what it means to enjoy white privilege in a white supremacist society. When you refuse to look at color, you refuse to look at yourself as a person with white privilege. Second, the use of derogatory insults in jokes. In my personal history, this reference would fall under the category of white silence. When people with white privilege stay complicitly silent when it comes to issues of race and white supremacy. When the racial jokes were being lobbied about, I may have put up a resistance, but not enough to stop the behavior. I was too often silent in the face of racist behavior. White silence works to defend the status quo. White privilege is maintained through inaction. As Dr. King wrote, quote, "It is often the silence of good people that hurts the most," end quote. And finally, repeated references to the moral fiber and strong work ethic unique to Europeans. This is clearly white exceptionalism. White Americans were raised and schooled that Europeans made the only history we're studying and ruled the world because of innate superior intelligence. Out of this belief comes white saviorism that states it is the duty of white people to save people of color from themselves. Continuing with my essay. Although as a teenager, I rebelled against my parents' political views and learned from firsthand experience at university that people of color were every bit the equals of the white population, I never fully understood the insidious nature of systemic racism. I was just another white liberal who thought that by disavowing racism, attending the occasional street protest, and having BIPOC friends, I was one of the good guys. Layla Saad would have ripped into me. White exceptionalism on full display. White exceptionalism is the belief that you, as a person holding white privilege, are exempt from the effects, benefits, and conditioning of white supremacy, and that therefore, the work of anti-racism does not really apply to me. White exceptionalists believe they aren't racist. They are one of the good ones. But believing that you are not racist does not erase reality. You are conferred unearned advantages called white privilege, whether you choose it or not. When you experience hardships and oppression in your life from other identities and experiences, You do not experience these things because of your skin color. And finally, the closing paragraph in my essay reads, I had no idea as a young adult that obtaining a mortgage was infinitely easier for a white couple than a BIPOC couple. I had no idea that the Anglo name on my resume would mean I would get preferential treatment over a resume with a foreign sounding or African-American sounding name. I wasn't fully aware of the extra scrutiny and distrust BIPOC individuals experience in their daily interactions with merchants, teachers, the police, and even their neighbors. All of this and more inequities that could be listed is the reality of BIPOC people living in the US. Until we, the beneficiaries of an unjust system of reward and punishment, are prepared to step out of our comfort zones and actively work to dismantle and rebuild our societal structures and eliminate society's prejudices, we are the racists causing the most harm and keeping systemic racism alive and well. Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy, was a difficult read, not because it was dry or boring, but because it was personally challenging who I thought I was, a good white person who supports the BIPOC community and isn't racist. It turns out I'm one of the very people I often complain about, the member of a community doing harm in the world, who remains silent in the face of injustice and continues reaping the benefits of an inequitable system. Not a nice conclusion to come to see my own white fragility and white exceptionalism on full display, but a revelation about my place in society that hopefully will lead to a more honest and engaged approach to overcoming the reality of systemic racism. Thank you.
Morning. Over the last 5 years, I'd heard of white folks getting together to learn about racism in the aftermath of yet another police killing of a Black person. But I didn't need to join a group or learn about racism. I mean, I'm not a racist. For heaven's sakes, some of my grandparents are from Mexico, and my mom spoke Spanish every day. I've had a Black roommate, Latinx roommate, an Asian American roommate, in addition to numerous BIPOC friends. Really, I didn't need to change, and I wasn't part of the problem. And white privilege, heck, no one did me any favors. I earned everything I have. Well, my conviction that I'm not part of the problem because of X, Y, and Z is known as white exceptionalism. It's the idea that the label racist refers only to people who think Black, Latinos, and others are inferior. White exceptionalism has been defined as the belief that you, as a person holding white privilege, are exempt from the effects, benefits, and conditioning of white supremacy, and therefore, the work of anti-racism does not apply to you. We are taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in the invisible systems conferring dominance on people who look like me, who look like us. In his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi defines racism as a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produce and normalize racial inequities. His focus is on the effect of an action rather than the feelings involved. It doesn't matter whether anyone intends to suppress the group or whether they dislike members of the disadvantaged group. I have found this change in emphasis from intent to do harm to the actual effect of the action or policy is critical to understanding today's understanding of racism. It explains why well-meaning people are considered racist when they ignore the effects or ideas of policies on people of color. No one I know wants to be considered a racist. Learning about the effect of policies and actions is essential to becoming anti-racist. This learning is a major part of what our group Moving Towards Racial Justice does. Of course, it is an ongoing journey, and you are welcome to join us at any time. It is an enlightening and important work, but it is not always fun or easy. Remember how I thought I earned everything I have? Well, since then, I've learned I have unearned advantages, which are called white privilege. It is not something we choose, and we often aren't aware of it, but it is very real. Most of us have experienced hardships and oppression in our lives, sometimes because of our poverty, our identity as women, or because of our sexual orientation. However, we don't experience oppression and hardship because of our skin color. Personally, even though I always self-identified as Mexican American growing up, except for the neighborhood, the world sees me as white. My teachers saw me as white, job interviewers, landlords, police. In short, I looked like them. White privilege shows up in many forms and places. For example, no one follows me in a store thinking that I'll steal. The books we read in school were written by white people about white people. Oh yeah, this is my family, some of them. I think the most striking example of white privilege is that I did not have to explain to my children that they need to be extremely cautious of the police. With the work we've done in our Moving Towards Racial Justice group, I come to realize that the policies of those in charge can affect generations. There is a huge wealth gap between whites and blacks in this country, and none of the reasons that I thought had heard of to account for the disparity actually held water. The unequal access to benefits from the Homestead Act, redlining, VA loans, restrictive housing covenants, government acquiescence in discriminatory loan practices, et cetera, have created a wealth imbalance that continues to benefit the white people. I now recognize the effects in my own family. My father's side of the family, with their English and Dutch surnames, were able to buy homes in nice neighborhoods, and those homes are appreciated greatly, and they all bought homes. It was assumed that the children would go to college, even my cousins who only wanted an MRS. The only question was they just wanted to get married, right? The only question was which college would they go to? My father was able to use his VA loan to buy a house in a good neighborhood. And he actually told me that when the blacks started moving in, he relocated our family to a predominantly white neighborhood. Not that it stayed that way. On the other hand, my mother's family largely struggles. This is just part. I have 27 cousins on my mom's side. And she has 6 brothers and a sister. That's my mom in the wheelchair. The surnames are Rodriguez, Alderete, and Martinez. Although all 6 of my mother's brothers served in the military, only 2 bought homes, one in East LA, one in Compton. Her other brothers rented apartments in poor neighborhoods. My mother told me that her brilliant brothers were not allowed to take college prep classes while in high school because it was considered a waste. Everyone assumed Mexicans would work as laborers, not go to college. This affected the next generation as well. Very few of my Martinez or Alderete cousins went to college either. They certainly didn't have any home equity to draw on, and there was no precedence or expectations they would continue their education. One cousin did go to college, and he continued on to Harvard Law School and a very successful career. I can't think of any other cousin. Well, all my cousins that grew up in Mexico, there's 7 of them, a few in that picture, they all went to college. My cousins, my Mexican-American cousins in LA did not, except one that I know of. I wonder what financial success my other cousins would have had they gone to college. Thank you.